Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're peeling away all the cozy fog that usually hangs over those fancy costume dramas and stepping straight into the real Victorian world. Not the polished one with shiny top hats and clean gowns you see on TV. No, tonight you're stepping into the streets of 1800s London, a place where the air was thick with more than just fog, and where a hot bath was about as rare as a dentist with every tooth still in his head. Before we dive in, take a second, settle in, maybe dim the lights, and get as comfortable as you can. Think of this as a bedtime story, but instead of drifting through peaceful fields, you're about to wander into a city where even the smell could knock you flat. And trust me, that smell is going to follow us everywhere. It's funny, when we think of the Victorian era, our minds jump to images of stiff collars, lace gloves, and grand houses lit by gas lamps. But if you actually woke up in the middle of a London morning around 1854, you'd find yourself shivering, staring at a frozen water jug with a chamber pot dangerously close to your toes. That was the real wake-up call. No steaming hot shower to start the day, no minty toothpaste waiting in the bathroom. Just a cracked porcelain basin, a rag that looked like it had been through a few too many wash cycles, and water so cold it felt like punishment. Imagine dipping your fingers in, hoping to freshen up, only for your skin to sting with the kind of chill that makes you regret being alive. That was morning hygiene, for millions. Now, before you wrinkle your nose too much, think about this. People didn't just deal with it. They built little routines out of this mess. A quick dab here, a brisk wipe there, and maybe, if you were feeling ambitious, a splash across your whole face. It wasn't about getting fresh, not really. It was about plausible deniability. If someone gave you the side eye on the omnibus, you could always blame the cabbage seller next to you. Or maybe just point out that everyone smelled bad, so who could tell? Cleanliness wasn't a standard. It was a performance, one everyone played just well enough to get by. And here's the thing, it wasn't the same for everyone. If you were wealthy, you might wake up in a sunlit room, where a servant brought in a jug of water, already warmed a little, where towels smelled faintly of lavender, and where the soap dish held something that wasn't chipped down to a sad sliver. Cleanliness was a kind of luxury you could show off. It said, "I don't just have money, I have the people who make sure I don't stink." But if you weren't wealthy, and let's be honest, most weren't, it was a different story. You were probably crouched in a cramped room, sharing that icy basin water with your siblings, sometimes even the family cat getting the first sip. Not exactly glamorous. Think about how different that feels compared to today. We complain if the shower pressure is weak. Back then, even having enough water for everyone in the family was a full production. Buckets hauled from pumps, water rationed out, and every drop precious. You didn't waste water on luxuries like washing your legs or feet. Those were saved for special occasions, end of the week kind of stuff. Most days, you stuck to face, armpits, maybe neck, and called it a victory. It sounds grim, but when you're living in a city of coal smoke, manure, and fish guts, being less smelly was already a win. The truth is, Victorian London was alive with contradictions. On the one hand, it was the heart of progress, the biggest city in the world, booming with industry, brimming with ambition. On the other hand, it was filthy. The streets overflowed with refuse, chamber pots were emptied out of windows with a casual "gardes," a polite French warning to duck, and rivers carried the city's waste right under people's noses. Life there was like standing inside a perfume shop where someone had just spilled rotten cabbage stew in the corner. Every scent mixed together, overpowering, impossible to escape. Now picture yourself as an average Londoner trying to make it through your day. You rub that postage stamp-sized sliver of soap between your hands, praying it multiplies like bread and fishes. It doesn't. You pull a comb through your hair, and it snags on something that might not even belong to you. You consider washing your hair, but then you remember people didn't wash hair regularly. Some went months without it. Instead, They relied on powders to soak up grease and pomade made from pig fat, bear grease, or whatever animal was unlucky enough to contribute. And if your hair smelled faintly of last week's stew, well, that's what perfume was for. It all sounds miserable, doesn't it? But here's where the story turns from just grim to strangely human. Victorians weren't blind to their situation. They laughed about it. They joked. They had little workarounds. They might complain about bath night, about the basin water, about lice in the com. But they also turned those struggles into rituals, into shared experiences. A family crammed around the fire, waiting their turn for the copper tub, wasn't just scrubbing away dirt. They were also building stories, gossiping, laughing, and sometimes yelling at whoever tracked mud into the house. Hygiene was social. It was messy. It was life. That's the hook to this whole journey we're starting tonight. Victorian hygiene wasn't just about soap and water. It was about class, survival pride, and sometimes pure stubbornness. It's about the poor mother licking her thumb to wipe her child's face before church. The rich lady powdering her skin with violet fragrance, pretending it covered everything. The night soil men who kept the streets from drowning in their own filth. And the millions of ordinary people caught in between, doing their best in a city that never smelled fresh, not even on its best days. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in, think of this not just a history lesson, but as a story. A bedtime story about people who lived through grime and stink and still found ways to smile, to laugh, and to carry on. We'll walk through their mornings, their baths, their perfumes, their beds full of bed bugs. We'll wander into their streets, their hospitals, their laundry rooms, and even their nightmares. It's a long road ahead, but trust me, it's fascinating. And now that you've stepped into the foggy dawn of Victorian London with me, let's keep going. Next up, we'll sink deeper into what that morning routine really looked like for the average person, rich or poor, and how a little basin of icy water could tell you everything about who you were and where you stood in this chaotic world. You wake up in Victorian London, and the first thing that greets you isn't the smell of fresh coffee or the warm rush of a shower. No, what you get is a jug of water that's frozen solid, a chamber pot daring you to move your feet, and the vague sound of a neighbour coughing up last night's soot through the paper-thin walls. Welcome to your morning wash. It's not so much a routine as it is a test of endurance. For most people, washing in the morning meant crouching over a chipped porcelain basin that held maybe a pint of water, less if your brother got to it first. The water wasn't warm. In fact, it was always, somehow, 3 degrees colder than you expected. No matter how much you braced yourself, you dipped your rag in, wrung it out, and patted your face, armpits, and maybe your neck if you were feeling luxurious, legs and feet. Forget it. Those were end-of-the-week luxuries. The point wasn't to get clean. The point was to get just clean enough that nobody would faint if they sat next to you on the omnibus. Soap, if you had any, was a stingy little sliver that smelled faintly of lemons and regret. You rubbed it between your hands, hoping for a miracle, but instead of fluffy suds, you just ended up with a sticky film that clung to your palms. Still, that tiny bit of lather was better than nothing. A mother might remind her children, cleanliness is next to godliness. But the reality was that cleanliness felt about as far away as indoor plumbing. You stared into the cloudy basin water, weighing whether it was worth dunking your whole face. Then you remembered the brain freeze from last week and settled for a quick dab. Now, imagine the contrast if you were wealthy. Your morning might start in a room flooded with sunlight, where a servant brought in a jug of warm water and a stack of lavender-scented towels. Maybe you had a silver-backed brush, maybe even a bar of rose soap resting on a little tray. The act of washing became a performance of luxury. You didn't just wipe your face, you basked in the idea that your life smelled faintly of roses instead of coal smoke. Your valet or maid made sure you barely touched the water yourself, because the whole point of wealth was to prove you didn't have to. Meanwhile, downstairs or across the street, working-class families were fighting over a shared basin of icy tap water. Kids lined up, rag in hand, while the cat licked from the same bowl. Sometimes the water even froze overnight, so you had to crack the ice with the handle of a comb before you could use it. And remember, this wasn't a private moment. In a single-room home, you had siblings shouting at you to hurry up, parents sighing at the waste of water, and maybe even a neighbor stomping in because they needed their turn. Privacy was not part of the package. And if you thought washing your hair was part of this ritual, think again. Most people didn't dare wash their hair more than a couple of times a year. Doctors warned about chills, neighbors whispered about the dangers of pneumonia, and society had a whole unspoken rule about not being seen in public with wet hair. Instead, hair care meant vigorous brushing, a sprinkle of powder to hide the grease, and a heavy dollop of pomade made of lard or bear grease to lock everything in place. You can picture it. You've just dabbed yourself with icy water, you've rubbed a sliver of soap down to nothing, and now you're patting coal dust or violet powder into your roots, praying nobody notices the smell. But the basin wasn't just about hygiene. It was about class, survival, and appearances. A clean face meant dignity. A dab behind the ears showed effort. And if you didn't bother at all, that was public shame. Even if your rag was stiff from drying on the window latch, even if the basin water had a suspicious film floating on top, you went through the motions. Because in Victorian London, cleanliness wasn't about how you felt. It was about how others saw you. And every basin told a story. The cracked porcelain in a cramped rented room, shared by siblings and cats. The polished jug of warm water in an upper-class bedroom, carried by a servant whose own hands were raw from lye. The difference between those two worlds was as wide as the River Thames, and often smelled just as bad. Still, no matter who you were, the morning wash had a rhythm: rinse, dab, sigh, repeat. The rag dried stiff on the windowsill. The basin water was dumped into the alley. Tomorrow, you'd do it all again. You didn't end up clean, not really. But you ended up prepared to face a city where the air itself was thick with coal smoke, horse manure, fish guts, and mystery puddles. Prepared to keep up appearances, even if you smelled like last night's cabbage stew. And maybe that's the most Victorian thing of all. The morning wash wasn't about freshness. It was about resilience, about surviving the day ahead with your head held high, your armpits dabbed just enough, and your dignity, well, at least most of it, still intact. Hair. That's where things get interesting. If the morning basin routine left you feeling sort of clean, your hair was where the illusion really came together, or fell apart. Because here's the truth, in Victorian England, washing your hair was practically a dangerous sport. Most people avoided it like the plague, literally. Doctors warned that wet hair could invite chills, pneumonia, or worse. The shame of being seen in public with damp locks was another risk. If your neighbours spotted you with wet hair, they'd whisper as if you'd committed a scandal. Better to let it stay greasy than risk death or disgrace, so actual shampooing, maybe once every few months if you were bold. For a lot of folks, maybe once or twice a year, that's right, a year. So what did they do instead? They brushed and brushed and brushed. Imagine dragging a family comb through your hair, a comb made of bone horn or carved wood that had already passed through 3 siblings, an uncle, and maybe even the family dog. These combs weren't gentle. Each pull yanked out tangles, lice, and anything else living rent-free on your scalp. And if you were lucky enough to own a knit comb, you became the family's first line of defense against head pests. Forget your soft plastic brushes today. Victorian combs had teeth so close together they could probably strain soup. Now, if brushing didn't do the trick, powders were the next best thing. Wealthy women dusted their roots with fine powders that smelled faintly of violets or lavender. It gave the illusion of freshness, fluffy, mattified hair instead of slick, oily strands. But if you weren't wealthy, you improvised. Coal dust, cornstarch, even plain flour. Anything that could soak up grease and dull the shine was fair game. You'd walk out of the house with hair that smelled like a flower shop or a bakery. Either way, better than smelling like yourself. And then came the real hero, or villain, depending on your perspective, pomade. Victorian pomade recipes were closely guarded family secrets. They started with fat, pig lard, beef soot, or if you were fancy, bear grease. Yes, actual bear grease, marketed as a luxury ingredient. These fats were melted down with beeswax, then mixed with rose water, burnt oil, or lavender. Not to make you clean, oh no, but to mask the smell of the fat itself. The result, a slick, heavy paste that glued stray hairs in place and gave your style a kind of industrial strength. Picture it: you scoop out a dollop of pomade, always more than you need, and smear it across your scalp. Your hair immediately shines, but not the clean kind of shine, more like a bacon grease shine. You smooth it back, pin it into place, and maybe sprinkle a little powder on top to balance things out. Congratulations. You've just created a hairstyle that could survive a rainstorm, a bar fight, and possibly a small explosion. That's not hair anymore. That's architecture. Women twisted their hair into elaborate buns, towers of braids, and updos held together with pins sharp enough to double as weapons. Men shaped their sideburns and mustaches with pomade, spit and sometimes candle wax if it was a special occasion. Mustaches curled into perfect handlebars. Sideburns fanned out like wings. Beards became badges of status. Your hair wasn't just about style, it was about identity. And then there were the hats. Hats weren't optional, they were part of the infrastructure. A top hat, a bonnet, or even a battered newsboy cap wasn't just fashion. It was cover. Hats hid grease, shielded you from rain, and gave you plausible deniability. If someone wrinkled their nose, you could always tilt your brim lower and pretend it wasn't you. Hats were shields, and in Victorian London, everyone needed one. Of course, when it finally came time to actually wash your hair, it was an ordeal. You scheduled the whole day for it. First came the boiling kettles of water, then came the mixture. Victorian shampoo wasn't store-bought in a bottle. It was a homemade blend of eggs, vinegar, gin and soapwort. Imagine cracking eggs into your hair and telling yourself this is cleanliness. You lathered, rinsed with freezing water, and then spent hours toweling, shaking, and praying your hair didn't freeze into icicles. Every cough afterward had your family staring at you like you'd signed your death warrant. Children had it worse. Parents attacked tangles with stiff brushes, sometimes goose fat, and when lice showed up, as they always did, kerosene was the treatment of choice. Imagine being 8 years old and having your scalp rubbed down with kerosene while your mother muttered about hygiene. It left scars, literal and otherwise. But when the bugs kept coming back, some families gave up entirely and just cut it all off. Even with all the grease, powder, and wax, facial hair was its own battlefield. Mustaches collected crumbs, soup, and tobacco ash. Beards smelled faintly of dinner. Men oiled, brushed, and waxed daily. But there was only so much you could do when your face doubled as a napkin. Still, a good beard wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Facial hair was fashion authority, and personal branding rolled into one. The grander your whiskers, the more respect you commanded. It's easy to laugh at the thought of walking around smelling like bacon and violets, hair stiff enough to survive a storm. But for Victorians, this was normal. It was part of the daily performance of looking respectable, even if you hadn't washed your scalp since last spring. And honestly, it worked. Nobody expected you to smell fresh. They just expected you to look like you were trying. So as you picture the streets of Victorian London, men in top hats with gleaming sideburns, women with buns tall enough to need scaffolding, remember what held it all together. Not soap, not shampoo, but fat, powder, and the stubborn determination to make it through another day looking just presentable enough. If the icy basin and greasy pomade weren't enough to set the tone for the day, the real battle began with clothes, not the polished outer layers you see in period dramas. The gowns, the frock coats, the shiny boots, but the undergarments. Because in Victorian London, underclothes weren't just about modesty. They were shields. Shields against dirt, sweat, and, frankly, embarrassment. Start with the basics: drawers. Long linen drawers that scratched and itched in all the wrong places. Add thick woolen stockings, undershirts, and chemises, and you were just getting started. For women, petticoat after petticoat went on, stacked until you felt like you were carrying half the linen closet. Then came the corset, tightened with grim determination until your waist resembled an hourglass or maybe a wasp. Men weren't spared either. They wriggled into union suits or long johns, one-piece contraptions that offered all the support of a wet paper bag and none of the breathability. Getting dressed wasn't a quick task. It was an endurance event. But here's the catch: all these layers weren't meant to be washed often. The whole point was that the undergarments absorbed the sweat, dust, and grime of the day so the expensive outer clothes could be worn again and again. Those fine frock coats and elegant gowns, they might go weeks, even months, without a proper wash. The underwear was the sacrificial lamb, changed a little more often, though even then often is generous. Many folks simply aired them out overnight by hanging them on a chair, letting the wind do what soap and water had not. You woke up, gave your drawers a shake, and convinced yourself they were fresh. Now, if you think that sounds uncomfortable, you're right. Linen itched, wool scratched, corsets dug in, men's collars felt like chokeholds. Every movement was restricted, every breath reminded you that fashion came before comfort. And yet everyone did it because that was the expectation. To show too much skin, or worse, to look unkempt, was social suicide. Clothes weren't just clothes. They were armor, proof you were respectable, no matter how much you were sweating underneath. And here's where perfume swooped in, like a knight in shining armor, or at least a cloud of lavender. Because let's be real, when you've been wearing the same petticoats all week, no amount of airing out is going to fool anyone. Victorians relied heavily on colognes, scented waters, and powders to cover the truth. These weren't gentle little spritzes like we know today. They were heavy, powerful, almost aggressive. Perfume was a weapon. You didn't dab it. You doused yourself in it. A splash on the wrists, a heroic pour down the front of your shirt, a generous dusting of violet powder on your hair and skin. The goal wasn't to smell nice. The goal was to stun the nose of anyone who got too close. Wealthy families flaunted their fragrances. Glass bottles with filigree tops sat on vanity tables like little monuments to excess. Exclusive scents from Paris promised refinement, sophistication, and, more importantly, distance from the stink of the streets. Walking into a drawing room heavy with rose water or bergamot was a status symbol in itself. It said, "We can afford to pretend we're clean." For the poor, even a faint hint of lavender water was a small rebellion, a pocket-sized piece of dignity they could carry into the world. Powders played their part too. Violet powder was fashionable, but orris root and talc were everyday staples. These powders weren't just about masking odor. They kept skin dry, kept clothing from sticking, and absorbed some of the dampness that came from living in a city perpetually soaked in rain and coal smoke. People dusted them on their wigs, their faces, their undergarments, anywhere that needed a little help. And sometimes entire families carried perfumed handkerchiefs to hold over their noses in public, each inhale a desperate vacation from reality. Of course, this created its own problems. Too much perfume, and you didn't smell clean. You smelled suspicious. Social etiquette demanded a careful balance, just enough scent to suggest effort, not so much that people assumed you were hiding something worse. But balance was tricky. Step onto an omnibus filled with men drenched in cologne, women powdered to the heavens, and children who'd been dabbed with lavender water for church, and you got a smell so powerful it could peel wallpaper. Still, for all its absurdities, the perfume ritual mattered. It gave people control. It gave them confidence. It gave them a way to step into the world with at least the illusion of freshness, and maybe that illusion was enough. Because in a city where every street reeked of manure, Fish guts, coal, and rotting vegetables, smelling like a faint bouquet of roses, mixed with bacon grease was practically a win. So next time you slip into a clean t-shirt and spritz on a light fragrance before heading out, think about the Victorians. Think about the layers they endured, the corsets they tightened, the drawers they aired out on chairs. Think about the violet powder they dusted everywhere, the rose water they poured like armor, and the endless battle they fought just to smell less bad. Clothes and perfume weren't just fashion. They were survival strategies. Bath night. Just saying those words in a Victorian home could send a shiver through the entire family. Not because anyone was excited. No one jumped up and shouted, "Yes! Soap and water for everyone!" No. Bath night was dreaded. It meant work. It meant hauling. It meant negotiation. And it meant sitting in water that got cloudier with every turn. Here's how it went. First, the ancient copper tub, usually kept in a corner, doubling as a laundry bin or even a temporary crib for the family cat, was dragged into the kitchen or by the fireplace. This was the warmest spot in the house, and you needed every bit of heat you could get. Then came the buckets. Someone had to haul freezing water from the pump outside up the stairs, sloshing half of it onto their shoes, which incidentally became the cleanest part of their body. Every drop had to be boiled on the stove, which meant chopping wood, stoking fires, and waiting forever for a kettle to heat. By the time the tub was half full, the entire kitchen looked like a foggy sauna and smelled faintly of cabbage stew from last week. And then came the politics. Who went first? That was a big deal. Usually, it was the breadwinner, the eldest, or whoever had the best arm wrestling record that week. That lucky person sank into water that was, for one brief, glorious moment, clean, maybe even warm. Soap rationed out carefully, was rubbed on arms, pits, and face. Nobody wasted it on legs. This was a brisk affair, in and out. If you lingered, the rest of the family yelled at you for hogging the heat. Next in line, still manageable. The water was lukewarm, a little cloudy, but you could convince yourself it was fine. Third in line. You were already questioning your life choices. By the time the kids got their turn, the water was something else entirely. Cloudy, murky, floating bits of lint, maybe a sock swirling around your ankles. It was less bath water and more Victorian soup. And you were the last ingredient. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about hygiene. Bath night was a social event. Siblings jeered from the sidelines. Parents barked instructions. The cat stared in horror from the hearth. Privacy. Forget it. Everyone was watching, laughing, and maybe throwing in the occasional insult about how long you were taking. If you were unlucky, extended family showed up. Suddenly the line doubled, the water cooled, and your patience dissolved faster than the last sliver of soap. Sometimes, for the truly unlucky, the family pet went last. That's right. After you and your siblings had marinated in that broth, the dog got tossed in. He probably enjoyed it more than you did. And then, when everyone was done, the bath water was dumped into the street. In winter, it froze into a treacherous sheet of ice for the neighbours to slip on. In summer, it ran down the gutter, mingling with chamber pot contents and horse droppings. Either way, it was gone, and the tub was shoved back into its corner until next week. Now, not every family had a tub. For many, the only option was the public bathhouse, and stepping into one of those was an adventure. Imagine a giant steam-filled hall packed with every flavour of humanity. For a penny, you could sit in a copper tub, separated from your neighbour by a thin curtain, if you were lucky. Privacy was a theory, not a reality. The air was hot, damp, and smelled of tar soap, wet wool, and ambition. Public baths weren't just about washing. They were about gossip. Bankers, chimney sweeps, errand boys, and housewives all sat shoulder to shoulder, scrubbing and swapping stories. Kids splashed, old women shared recipes and remedies, and men argued about cricket scores and politics. Somewhere in the corner, someone was loudly complaining about Mrs. Abernathy's goose again. The bathhouse was like a community centre, except everyone was half-dressed and pretending not to look at each other's ankles. The rules of etiquette were unspoken but strict. Don't splash. Don't stare. Don't ask about that mysterious floating object in the next tub. Soap and towels were shared, in theory washed between uses, but they usually looked like they'd been around since the previous monarch. You dried yourself with whatever was left, often a scratchy communal towel, and told yourself it was exfoliating. Still, for all the awkwardness, the public bath was a small miracle. For a few hours, you could feel almost clean, your skin tingled, your hair dripped. You walked out into the street refreshed, up to date on the latest gossip, and convinced you'd survived a trial by water. Clean, not exactly, but fresher, more hydrated, and in Victorian London, that counted as a win, but even here class lines showed. The wealthy had private bathrooms, tubs drawn by servants, and fancy soaps imported from Paris. Their baths smelled of rose and almond. Their towels were soft and monogrammed. The poor had public baths, shared soap, and scratchy rags. But both groups were fighting the same battle, trying to stay one step ahead of the stink. So, bath night wasn't about luxury. It was about survival, family politics, and learning to accept that you were never going to be truly clean. You were just going to be cleaner than yesterday. And that was good enough. If you thought bath night was grim, wait until we peek inside a Victorian mouth. Because brushing your teeth in the 1800s was less about minty freshness and more about survival. Forget that cool burst of spearmint we take for granted today. Back then, toothpaste might taste like soot, salt, or vinegar. And that was on a good day. The toothbrush itself. Imagine a shoe polisher on a stick, bristles made from pig or horse hair jammed into a handle carved from bone, wood, if you were wealthy, ivory. They weren't soft. They weren't ergonomic. They were stiff, scratchy, and more likely to scrape your gums than clean your enamel. For the working poor, even that was too expensive. Many made do with a rag wrapped around a finger, dipped in whatever abrasive powder they could find, chalk, charcoal, or ashes from last night's fire. You weren't polishing your teeth so much as sanding them down, and the toothpaste, or more often tooth powder, was a whole other adventure. No tidy little tube. Instead, you'd dip your brush into a jar of something gritty, crushed charcoal, chalk dust, soot, salt, even ground cuttlefish bone. If you had money, maybe it smelled faintly of cloves or peppermint oil. If you didn't, it probably just tasted like last night's fireplace. Some even swished with vinegar or gin, claiming it kept teeth white. Others went further. Yes, people really used urine as a rinse, swearing it worked as a natural whitener. Imagine waking up, dunking your rag-wrapped finger into ashes, and then finishing with a mouthful of vinegar. That was considered dental care. Still, brushing wasn't universal. Many skipped it entirely, and with sugar flooding into England from the Empire, teeth rotted fast. Blackened teeth became so common among the upper classes that they were almost fashionable. A badge of wealth, proof you could afford sugar. Working folks, they just gummed their bread and got on with life. But the real terror came when you needed a dentist, because in Victorian London, dentist was a generous word. Often, it was your local barber surgeon. He'd sharpen his straight razors in the morning, shave a few men by noon, and then yank someone's molar by afternoon. His toolkit, forceps, maybe a hammer and nerves of steel, or maybe just deafness to the screams. Anesthetics were rare. Sometimes you got nitrous oxide, laughing gas, but mostly it was brandy, a leather strap to bite, and the nurse telling you to hold still. Extractions were the go-to solution. Yank it. Abscess? Yank it. Loose tooth? Yank it anyway. Fillings existed, but they were made from molten lead, tin, or hammered gold foil. Nobody was entirely sure if they were supposed to stay in your mouth long term. Many didn't. The procedure was loud, public, and brutal. Sometimes the tooth came out clean. Sometimes you left with part of your jawbone. If you survived the dentist, you rinsed your mouth with salt water, brandy, or just tried not to talk for a week. Preventive care was mostly folk remedies. Candies flavored with cloves or licorice to mask bad breath, chewing on twigs or quills to dislodge food, or rubbing lemon juice on teeth which felt fresh but stripped away enamel. And then there were toothpicks, goose quills, matchsticks, bits of wood, even the corner of a playing card if you were desperate. Dinner often ended with the whole table politely covering their mouths while they dug around in their molars. It wasn't so much etiquette as damage control. And here's the kicker: dentists weren't just painful, they were dangerous. Infection was rampant. Tools weren't sterilized, just wiped on the surgeon's apron, already decorated with blood from yesterday's patients. Sepsis, lockjaw, and abscesses often killed people faster than the tooth hatch would have. Walking into a dental chair in the 1800s was like spinning a roulette wheel with your life. So, when you look at old Victorian photos and wonder why nobody's smiling, the answer might be simple. They didn't want to show their teeth. Or maybe they didn't have many left. Smiling was less a social grace and more an act of bravery. Kissing, only if you really loved someone, and even then, maybe just a polite handshake. It's easy to laugh at it now, but for Victorians, oral hygiene was just another daily battle. If you could make it through the day without a throbbing toothache, you were ahead of the game. Every tooth in your head was a small victory against sugar, grime, and amateur dentistry. So the next time you brush with a minty, foamy paste in a soft bristled brush, spare a thought for the Victorians. They started their mornings spitting soot into a cracked basin, praying the barber's forceps wouldn't come for them anytime soon. Their smiles weren't Hollywood perfect, but they were hard-earned. If brushing your teeth felt like a gamble, then dealing with the chamber pot was a full-on nightmare. Forget porcelain thrones, forget flush toilets with a satisfying whoosh. Most Victorian homes had a pot. A squat, stinky pot tucked under the bed like a silent threat, waiting for you in the dark. It was porcelain if you were wealthy, decorated with flowers or even political cartoons to lighten the mood. If you weren't, it was plain clay or tin, dented and cracked from years of use. But, rich or poor, everyone dreaded the same thing: 2 a.m. nature calls. You fumbled around in the dark, praying you didn't kick the pot over onto your socks. The floorboards creaked, the cat watched, and your only thought was, please, not on the carpet. For kids, the chamber pot was a rite of passage. Toddlers graduated from little makeshift potties to the family pot with pride. Older siblings, of course, perfected the art of denial. That's not mine. In some homes, one pot was shared by several people, raising the stakes and lowering the air quality. In the poorest tenements, privacy was a fantasy. A single pot in the corner might serve a whole household, and the smell alone could peel the paint off the walls. Morning brought the dreaded ritual emptying. Nobody wanted the job. If you were a servant, it fell to you. If you weren't, you drew the short straw, or just learned to detach emotionally. You tiptoed down the stairs, gripping the pot like it was a live bomb. Every bump of the step felt like it might trigger disaster. If you were lucky, you made it to the backyard privy or cesspit. If not, well, shortcuts happened. Tenants in tall buildings had a particularly grim habit, opening the window and letting gravity do the work. The polite phrase was "Gaille," French for "watch out for the water." Of course, it wasn't really water. Walking down certain alleys in London was a high-risk sport. You needed speed, luck, and maybe divine intervention to avoid being splattered by last night's stew from above. But once you dumped the contents, you still had to clean the pot. Soap and water if you had them, vinegar if you didn't. Some swore by hot ashes. No matter what you did, there was always a lingering smell, a souvenir that clung to the porcelain, and sometimes to you. Now, multiply that by hundreds of thousands of homes. The math is staggering. London was a city of millions, and every night, every pot had to be dealt with. Enter the night soil men. These men were the unsung backbone of Victorian urban hygiene. They worked under cover of darkness, trudging from house to house with long-handled scoops and battered lanterns. From 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., they collected chamber pots, privies, and cesspits, dumping them into carts that became rolling monuments to human misery. The smell was indescribable, so bad that even the rats, legend says, held their noses. Night soil men were social outcasts. No one wanted to see them. No one wanted to talk to them. But everyone needed them. Without their work, the city would have drowned in its own filth within days. It was thankless, dirty, and dangerous. But for a while, it paid surprisingly well. A good wage for a job nobody else wanted. Some even felt a strange pride in their work, knowing they were essential even if society treated them like ghosts. Their routes were mapped in memory, not by landmarks, but by smells. They knew which households tipped generously, which ones dumped waste too late, which alleys froze solid in winter, and which cesspits overflowed in summer. They worked in silence, avoiding main streets, moving quickly before dawn so respectable Londoners could pretend none of this existed. Out of sight, out of mind, out of nose. But everyone knew when the night soil men had passed. The streets smelled faintly less awful. You could step outside without plunging into a puddle of last night's stew. And in some twisted way, that was a victory. Their work didn't end in the city. Once collected, the waste was hauled to the edge of town. Sometimes it was buried, sometimes dumped in pits, and sometimes, if the city was feeling enterprising, sold as fertilizer to nearby farms. In this way, the cycle of Victorian life continued. What left the chamber pot might come back as next season's cabbage, not poetic but efficient. Children pointed and giggled at the night soil carts. Adults crossed the street to avoid them. But no matter how much people pretended otherwise, everyone depended on them. They were invisible until they weren't, heroes or pariahs, depending on which way the wind was blowing. So the next time you flush a toilet and watch everything disappear with a swirl of clean water, pause for a second. Think of the Victorian chamber pot, the nervous tiptoe down the stairs, and the men hauling carts of filth through the night. It's grim, it's gross, but it's the truth, and it's the reason London managed to survive at all. By now, you've got the picture: chamber pots under beds, night soil carts trundling through alleys, rivers doubling as garbage dumps. But there comes a moment when even a city as stubborn as London has to admit things have gone too far. That moment came in the summer of 1858. It was so bad, so unmissable, that the newspapers didn't even try to exaggerate it. They just called it what it was: the Great Stink. Picture this. It's a blistering hot summer, temperatures soaring into the high 90s. The River Thames, the city's lifeline, its pride, the place where royalty once floated in pleasure boats, had turned into something no one could ignore. Every chamber pot, every cesspit overflow, every bucket of waste from the brand new flush toilets was being dumped directly into the river. And that year, the heat was merciless. The water level dropped low. Piles of raw sewage baked in the sun. The stench rolled across the city in waves so powerful they made people gag. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was unbearable. Members of Parliament couldn't sit in the House of Commons, which sat right on the riverbank. The curtains were soaked in chloride of lime in a desperate attempt to mask the smell. It didn't work. The stench seeped into everything: clothes, hair, even the pages of books. There were stories of people vomiting if they got too close to the river. Queen Victoria herself was said to have cut a pleasure cruise short after just minutes because the smell was so overwhelming. Londoners were used to filth. They'd lived with coal smoke, manure, and chamber pots for generations. But this was different. This was the city itself revolting. The Thames wasn't a river anymore. It was an open sewer, a giant, foul wound cutting through the heart of the capital. And here's the kicker: people didn't even fully understand what was happening. At the time, most still believed in the miasma theory, the idea that diseases like cholera were spread by poisonous vapors, bad air rising from rotting matter. And with the Great Stink choking the city, it seemed obvious. If foul smells could kill, then London was about to drop dead. But behind the panic, a few sharp minds were piecing things together. Years earlier, a doctor named John Snow had traced a deadly cholera outbreak in Soho to a single water pump on Broad Street. He proved it was the water, not the air, that carried disease. His discovery was largely ignored at the time. Too radical, too simple, but the Great Stink made his warning impossible to ignore. The river wasn't just smelly, it was deadly. That's when Parliament finally acted. In just 18 days, lightning speed for Victorian bureaucracy, they passed a bill to fund a massive new sewer system. And the man they called to design it was Sir Joseph Bazalgette. Now, Bazalgette isn't exactly a household name, but he should be. This was an engineer with vision. His plan was staggering: 300 miles of sewers, built with over 300 million bricks, designed to carry waste far downstream, away from the main population. It was bold, it was expensive, and it was absolutely necessary. Construction wasn't easy. Crews dug vast tunnels beneath the city, laying pipes, pouring concrete, and connecting neighborhoods to the new system. It took years. It was filthy, dangerous work. But slowly, steadily, London got a new underground artery, one that didn't carry waste into the city, but carried it away. And it worked. Cholera outbreaks, once a constant nightmare, began to vanish. The last major outbreak in 1866 happened in an area not yet connected to Bazalgette's system. Proof beyond doubt that disease came from contaminated water, not foul air. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister would soon back this up, proving germ theory and changing medicine forever. But on the ground, ordinary Londoners just knew one thing: the river no longer stank like death. The Great Stink became a turning point. It wasn't just about smell, it was about dignity. For centuries, people had lived with filth as if it were inevitable. Bazalgette's sewers proved it didn't have to be that way, that a government could step in, spend money, and actually make life healthier, safer, and better. And here's a little fun fact. Bazalgette, being a cautious man, built his sewers twice as large as they needed to be, just in case the city kept growing. He couldn't have known that London would balloon into one of the biggest metropolises in the world. But his foresight means his system is still in use today. Over 150 years later, that's legacy. So imagine that summer of 1858, a city choking on its own waste, politicians holding scented handkerchiefs to their noses, and one engineer sketching a plan that would change everything. Out of the stink came progress, out of the filth came science, and out of the river rose a cleaner, healthier London. The Great Stink wasn't just a crisis, it was a wake-up call, and like so many moments in history, it took disaster to spark change. By now, you can probably guess one thing: in Victorian London, not everyone smelled the same. Oh sure, everyone battled coal smoke, manure, and river stench, but the difference between the upstairs crowd and the downstairs folk was enormous. Cleanliness wasn't just a personal choice, it was a privilege. Let's start at the top. If you were a lord, a lady, or just comfortably wealthy, hygiene was practically a team sport. You didn't wash yourself, others washed you. Your maid stood ready with warm jugs of water, your valet polished your boots, and your laundry was hauled off by someone else's aching arms. Your day began in a sunlit dressing room, maybe with a silver brush, lavender-scented towels, and a bar of rose soap that looked more like a decoration than something meant for scrubbing. A lady's hands didn't touch soap, unless she felt especially rustic. Gentlemen shaved with hot water prepared just right, then dabbed imported aftershave. Cleanliness wasn't about necessity, it was about appearance, about floating through life wrapped in rose water and silk, convinced dirt was something that only existed in paintings of peasants. Downstairs, though things were rougher, the same servants who polished boots and drew baths had hands raw from lye soap and boiling water. Their bath might be whatever lukewarm water was left after their employers finished. Their soap wasn't delicate rose cakes on silver trays. It was a harsh, yellow block of lye, cheap, caustic, and stinging. They scrubbed floors with it, scrubbed linens with it, then scraped together slivers for themselves. If they ran out, they made do with sand, ashes, or just a rag and determination. The divide wasn't just about comfort. It was about economics. A male labourer might earn 20 shillings a week, while the poorest got only pennies a day. A trip to the public bath cost 1 or 2 pennies. A loaf of bread cost about 1 penny. That meant choosing between food and a bath. And food always won. Soap itself was so precious it was practically currency. For the rich, it was displayed proudly. For the poor, it was rationed down to slivers and pressed together to avoid waste. Laundry told the same story. Upstairs, linens were laundered daily, starched until they could stand on their own, and scented with lavender. Downstairs, servants wrestled mountains of clothing on Blue Mondays, the infamous laundry day. They hauled water by hand, boiled it in copper pots, scrubbed until their knuckles bled, and wrung out sheets heavy enough to break a back. Their own clothes. Lucky if they got washed at all. They wore what they had until it smelled, then brushed, beat, or aired it out on a chair. That was as good as it got. And then there was dignity. For the wealthy, hygiene was part of their social status. A perfumed handkerchief waved in the air wasn't just about avoiding bad smells. It was a signal. I belong upstairs. I can afford to smell like violets instead of sweat. For the poor, every clean face and fresh shirt was an act of rebellion against circumstances. They weren't dirty out of laziness. They were dirty because water cost money, soap cost more, and time was a luxury they didn't have. Think of the working class man. He woke before dawn, dressed in the same patched shirt he'd worn for years, trudged off to shovel coal or haul crates all day. By the time he got home, the idea of a bath was laughable. Maybe he wiped his face and hands with a pint of rationed water. Maybe he scrubbed behind his ears if no one was watching. That was the best he could do. His children were no different. Little urchins who returned home covered in soot and sticky with toffee, scrubbed down with a spit-soaked rag by their mothers. Meanwhile, a gentleman upstairs had his valet waiting with warm shaving water and imported cologne. A lady sat at her vanity while her maid arranged her hair, powdered her face, and spritzed her with perfume. Two worlds, divided by the same staircase, living in the same house but galaxies apart. And yet, despite all that, both groups were fighting the same enemy. Coal dust didn't care if you were rich. Chamber pots didn't care if you were titled. Even in the grandest mansions, the air still carried the stink of the Thames. The difference was that the wealthy could shield themselves with layers of perfume, lavender soap, and servants' labour, while the poor had nothing but grit and hope. So when people talk about the great unwashed, it wasn't about laziness. It was about survival. If you could afford to look clean, you did. If you couldn't, you made do with what little you had. Every scrubbed collar, every patched stocking, every whiff of lavender water dabbed to a wrist was a statement: I may be poor, but I refuse to surrender completely to the grime. That's the thing about Victorian hygiene. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about class. Who got to float above the filth and who had to slog through it. Upstairs and downstairs, perfumed and wary, two sides of the same city, breathing the same smoky air, but living completely different lives. If there was one day Victorian families dreaded more than bath night, it was laundry day. They even had a nickname for it, Blue Monday. And trust me, there was nothing cheerful about it. Laundry wasn't just a chore. It was a multi-day ordeal, the kind of task that left your back aching, your hands raw, and your dignity flapping in the breeze along with your bloomers. Think of it less like housework and more like a full-body workout you never signed up for. The day started before sunrise, buckets clanged, kettles hissed, and the first order of business was always water. Remember, there was no tap to turn on. Every drop had to be fetched from a well, a pump, or, if you were desperate, the river. You lugged heavy buckets back home, splashing half on your shoes, which by now were permanently soaked anyway. Then came the boiling. Copper cauldrons were lit, fires stoked, and soon the air was thick with steam, the smell of soap, and the faint tang of singed patience. And then the real work began: de-scrubbing. Victorian laundry wasn't about gently coaxing dirt out. It was about attacking it with brute force. Clothes were beaten against stones, rubbed against washboards, and twisted until your knuckles screamed. stains, treated with lye, vinegar, kerosene, even potatoes if you were feeling optimistic. Some families had secret recipes. Blue starch for whites, lemon juice for linens, coal dust for, well, probably making things worse. Every garment was a battle. Soap was both weapon and treasure. The wealthy had dainty cakes of rose or almond soap perched on silver trays. The poor made do with harsh yellow lye soap, thick, gritty bricks that stripped fabric and skin with equal enthusiasm. Soap was rationed down to the tiniest slivers, saved in jars, melted into soap jelly, and pressed together to stretch every ounce. If you ran out, you improvised. Ashes from the fireplace, sand from the yard, oatmeal if you were desperate. Nothing was off limits. Cleanliness, at least in theory, demanded sacrifice. Once the scrubbing was done, rinsing began. Buckets of cold water were dumped and refilled. Clothes twisted until your arms felt like overcooked noodles. Heavy sheets and quilts sometimes needed 2 women to wring them out. By this point, your hands were puckered, stinging from soap burns, and your face coated with sweat and coal dust. And then, drying. This was where the neighborhood came alive. Every yard, rooftop, and alley transformed into a forest of flapping laundry. Shirts, drawers, and stockings waved like surrender flags in the wind. If you were unlucky, a gust carried your underpants into Mrs. Fothergill's rose bushes, and you had to fetch them while she and the neighbors laughed. Winter was worst. Clothes froze stiff on the line, solid enough to stand upright. In summer, they collected coal soot before they were even dry. Either way, you prayed the weather held out, because nothing ruined a week's work faster than a sudden London downpour. Finally, ironing. Flat irons were beasts, heavy lumps of cast iron heated on the stove until they were hot enough to scorch a shirt in seconds. You tested them on scraps first, but even then, accidents happened. More than one family lived with permanent scorch marks on their Sunday best. Starch stiffened collars until they could slice bread, while cuffs were pressed until they stood out like tiny shields. Now, imagine doing all this not just for your own family, but for someone else's. That was the life of a Victorian laundry woman. They were the unsung titans of hygiene, the iron ladies who kept London looking respectable. Their days began before sunrise, hauling water, scrubbing, rinsing, drying, ironing, and finally delivering baskets almost as big as themselves through muddy streets. Their hands were permanently red and raw, their backs bent, but their reputations were everything. A good laundress was worth her weight in soap. Everyone in town knew who could whiten collars best, who never lost a stocking, and who could be trusted with silk. The work was backbreaking, but it was also survival. Laundry women often supported entire families with their earnings. They were entrepreneurs in their own right, negotiating prices, managing schedules, and sometimes working alone in conditions that invited harassment. Yet, despite their importance, their labour was seen as unladylike. Respectability didn't always reach as far as the washtub. Still, there was a kind of pride in it. Laundry women knew they carried the city's dignity on their shoulders. Every crisp shirt, every clean sheet, every freshly whitened collar was proof of their grit. They fought grime not just for themselves, but for everyone else. Without them, even the wealthiest drawing rooms would have reeked of sweat and soot. And so, Blue Monday ended in exhaustion. Women collapsed into bed, their arms trembling, their lungs full of steam, their knuckles raw. But the city slept in clean linens because of them. It's easy to forget that in a world without washing machines, every fresh shirt was bought with pain, effort, and bone-deep resilience. Step outside your door in Victorian London, and the city hit you right in the nose. Forget fresh air. Forget crisp morning breezes. What you got instead was a swirling cocktail of scents so layered and complex it could knock out a modern perfumer. Coal smoke, horse manure, fish guts, rotting vegetables, beer spilled outside the pub. And that was before you got to the part of the street where someone had just emptied a chamber pot out the window. The streets themselves were chaos. Horses clopped by, their droppings immediately churned into mud by wagon wheels. Chimney sweeps darted barefoot through crowds, Soot streaked across their faces. Street hawkers shouted about fresh eels, apples, or cheap ribbons. Ladies lifted their skirts to avoid puddles that were less water and more mystery stew. Men in tall hats strode through like they owned the place, only to slip on soap suds or a banana peel someone tossed from upstairs. And then there were the sounds. The screech of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones. The cries of newspaper boys. Dogs barking, chickens escaping, children shrieking with glee as they chased one another through alleys. A cracked piano somewhere in the distance, valiantly pounding out Beethoven. The streets were alive. Messy, noisy, and impossible to escape. Children were everywhere. Victorian kids weren't tucked neatly into playgrounds or supervised with snacks in hand. They were wild, running loose in a world that doubled as their schoolyard. They climbed on carts, splashed in puddles, and invented games in coal yards. Clothes patched so many times they were more mending than fabric. Shoes often missing entirely. Dirt streaked on their faces like permanent war paint. If they were sent to school, they carried more than books. They carried lice, coughs, and whatever disease was currently making its rounds. Baths for children rare. Maybe once a week if their family had a tub. More often, it was a quick scrub with a spit-wetted rag before church. Mothers licked their thumbs, wiped sticky cheeks, and muttered about cleanliness being next to godliness, even as their kids ran back outside to roll in mud 5 minutes later. Clothes were brushed down, aired out on chairs, or just accepted as hopeless. If it wasn't crawling, it was considered fine, and the smells didn't stop with manure and fish guts. Add in vinegar from pickling shops, smoke from factory chimneys, cabbage stewing in tenement kitchens, and the ever-present hint of beer wafting from pubs. On Sundays, the air briefly improved. Roasting meat, gravy, the comforting smell of family dinners. But by Monday morning, the miasma was back, heavier than ever, fueled by the weekend's excess. Factories made it worse. Rows of smokestacks belched coal and chemicals into the sky. If you lived near a dye works, your laundry came back with a faint tint of indigo or red, depending on the day's production. If you lived near a tannery, the smell was sharp, sour, and unforgettable. And if you were unlucky enough to live near the Thames, well, you didn't just smell the river. You endured it. A foul cocktail of sewage, industrial waste, and dead fish baking under the sun, people coped in whatever ways they could. Perfumed handkerchiefs were essential. Dainty squares of linen soaked in lavender or rose water, pressed to noses like portable air fresheners. Carrying one wasn't just practical. It was a status signal. You could walk through the stink and say with your postured, "Yes, I smell it too." "No, I don't accept it." Others tried charcoal, dusting it in hats, underarms or shoes, hoping it absorbed odours. The result, you smelled like a campfire with a hint of violets. But hey, it was better than nothing. Street sweepers tried to keep up, but it was like fighting a losing battle. They swept manure, trash, and slime into piles, only to have the tide of filth return within hours. Rain made things worse. Gutters overflowed, alleys turned into rivers, and puddles grew suspiciously opaque. On rare sunny days, dust swirled into clouds, coating clothes, hair, and even food. There was no winning, and yet life went on. Shopkeepers opened their shutters. Street vendors laid out their goods. Children dashed through muck, unbothered. Neighbours gossiped on stoops, handkerchiefs pressed discreetly to noses. Everyone adapted, because in Victorian London, you didn't escape the smells. You endured them. You made jokes, you splashed on perfume, you pinched your nose, and you kept walking. That's the resilience of the Victorians. They lived in a world where cleanliness was fleeting, grime was everywhere, and even fresh air smelled like soot. But they didn't give up. They carried on. One perfumed handkerchief, one spit-shined child, one cautious step across a filthy street at a time. And now, as we leave the smoky streets and dim kitchens of Victorian London behind, it's worth pausing to take a breath. Because what we've just walked through, icy basins, greasy pomade, endless laundry, chamber pots, and sewers, isn't just about dirt. It's about people. People trying to survive, to find dignity, and sometimes even to laugh, in a world stacked against them. Think of it, every single day was a negotiation with grime. The wealthy upstairs, perfumed and powdered, convincing themselves that a rose-scented handkerchief was proof of refinement. The poor downstairs, scraping slivers of soap, hauling buckets of icy water, and choosing between a loaf of bread or a trip to the public bath. Children running wild, mothers scrubbing faces with spit, fathers trudging home in patched shirts stiff with coal dust. Even the night soil men, trudging through the shadows, carrying away the city's filth so the rest of London could breathe one more day. And yet, for all its stink and struggle, there's something strangely comforting about their resilience. They found ways to cope. They powdered their hair with coal dust and pretended it was lavender. They aired out their drawers on chairs and called them fresh. They dunked themselves in cloudy bath water and laughed while their siblings jeered from the sidelines. They even perfumed handkerchiefs so heavily that a whole omnibus smelled like a flower shop caught on fire. The great stink of 1858 forced change. Bazalgette's sewers carved out a cleaner future. Germ theory replaced miasma myths. Hospitals slowly learned to wash their instruments. And step by step, London dragged itself out of the muck. But for most ordinary Victorians, progress didn't come as grand breakthroughs. It came in little victories, a fresh sliver of soap, a collar scrubbed just white enough, a rare warm jug of water carried upstairs by a kind servant. When we look back, it's easy to wrinkle our noses, to laugh at pomade made of pig fat or toothpaste made of soot. But imagine how they saw it. Every dab of powder, every splash of lavender water, every scrubbed sheet was proof of effort. Proof that they were still trying to live with dignity, even when the world was stacked high with grime. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Hygiene for them wasn't just about being clean. It was about survival, identity, and hope. It was about showing the world, even through layers of sweat, soot, and stink, that they hadn't given up. So tonight, as you lie back in a bed that doesn't itch with lice or smell faintly of cabbage stew, be grateful. Grateful for hot showers. Grateful for soft soap that smells like mint or vanilla instead of kerosene. Grateful for toothbrushes that don't double as torture devices. Grateful for socks that are dry, laundry that doesn't take 3 days, and sewers that keep the streets from drowning in chamber pot stew. History is messy, and Victorian hygiene proves it. But it also proves something else: people are stubborn. People adapt. People find ways to laugh, even when the joke smells terrible. So as you drift off tonight, think of the Victorians with a bit of sympathy. They didn't have deodorant, or plumbing, or minty toothpaste. But they had grit. They had determination. And they left us a reminder that even in the smelliest of times, humanity carries on. May your dreams tonight be fragrant, your blankets cozy, and your worries as fleeting as a Victorian's bar of soap. Good night.